My name is Susie Pappas, and today is September 26, 2018. I'm interviewing Edie Slotkin at the Max M. Fisher Federation Building in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. This interview is being recorded as part of the Women in Leadership Oral History Project. Do you give permission to the Leonard N. Simons Jewish Community Archives to publish, duplicate, or otherwise use this recording for educational purposes and for use as deemed appropriate by the archives?
I do.
The Women's Philanthropy Department of Jewish Federation has had several names throughout its history, including Women's Division, Women's Campaign and Education Department, but for the purposes of this interview, we will refer to it by its current name, Women's Philanthropy. Okay, Edie, when and where were you born?
I was born in 1936 in Cincinnati, Ohio, at the Cincinnati Jewish Hospital.
Okay, and where did you go to school?
I went to Avondale School and then to Walnut Hills High School, which is a college preparatory high school in Cincinnati.
It's a private, was it a private school?
No, public school, but it drew citywide. It was an interesting school.
So, as a child, how was religion observed in your home?
You know, my grandparents came from Russia and Romania, and one half of the family remained very Orthodox, the Romanians. But my Russian grandparents really became, I think, to become more American, became sort of Reformed, sort of, not completely. And my mother was very, very active in the community and was the president of the Sisterhood of the Isaac M. Wise Temple. And I went to Sunday school for 13 years. In fact, my high school years were at the Hebrew Union College, so I knew rabbis. I still knew, well, most of them have probably passed away, but I know rabbis from all over the country.
So interesting.
And we were Reform, but religiously Reform.
So what does that mean, religiously Reformed?
Well, we were very active in the temple, and we observed all the holidays. And although we weren't really strict, we didn't observe that strictly. But it was very important. No, but it was very important in our lives because of my mother. My mother was really very, very involved.
So you mentioned that your mother was involved in the community. So philanthropy was important to your family when you were growing up, and in what
Yes.
ways beyond that?
All right. My dad was a physician. He was an internist. But my mother really reached out in the whole community. She was the president of the Sisterhood, as I said. She was the president of the Brandeis chapter. She was involved in the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati, which, by the way, has really grown. In those days, it was not the biggest thing. She was Ruth Lodge, that's the Order of True Sisters. My mother won the equivalent of the Butzel Award when she was 80. It was the Cincinnati Leadership Award. And we went in to hear her speak, and it was very thrilling. It really was.
Wow.
So mother led the way.
So when you were a teenager, were you involved in any activities?
Judaically, you mean?
Yes.
You know, it's interesting. I was not involved in AVTI, the Ohio Valley Temple Youth, but I was very involved in the Sunday school, which I loved. The Isaac M. Wise, you know, Cincinnati was sort of, I guess, the seat of Reform Judaism.
Right.
And Wise Temple was a beautiful, wonderful place and played a very big part of my life. In fact, we went to Sunday school on Saturday because the classes were so big. There was a Saturday class and a Sunday class. And Wednesday during the week, we had a class. And so we didn't do bat mitzvahs in those days, but I was consecrated and I was confirmed at the Plum Street Temple, which is this edifice in downtown Cincinnati.
So we didn't talk about whether you had siblings. Did you have siblings?
I have one sister who's 6 years younger.
Okay.
And she lives still in Cincinnati.
So did she do any community stuff?
Not really. She's works, and she and her husband are in the arts in Cincinnati. She was employed by the School for the Performing Arts, where he was the musical director. And at one time it was quite something in Cincinnati. And then they left and they started the Cincinnati Children's Theater, which was something the Junior League of Cincinnati did, and they built that into something that was international. So they're retired now. They're retired now.
You really were the one that carried on the
the more Judaic
Right,
tradition,
right.
right?
So after high school, where did you go to college?
I went to Michigan.
How did you happen to choose Michigan?
When I was 13, my dad had a friend who was a physician who was an alum. He had been a football player, and he gave us 3 tickets to homecoming. And we came and we stayed at the Book Cadillac, and we went up to Ann Arbor, and I had a mum corsage. We sat in the end zone, and I was blown away. And my parents were very, very big sports fans. My dad was on the faculty of the University of Cincinnati, and he was very involved in all their sports teams. He had patients who were Cincinnati Reds. And at that time, the professional basketball team, the Big O, Oscar Robertson, his whole family was, Oscar is still a friend of the family's. And they loved the Big Ten, although I would not have ever gone to Ohio State. That was anathema. Oh no, my high school, yes. At the time, Ohio State scholastically was not what it is today. And everybody, 99% of my senior class went to college, and they mostly went to Eastern schools. In fact, I almost went to Wellesley, and I almost went to Wheaton. I got into Wheaton and Wellesley, and we always laughed, Donald and I, because he was at Harvard. We would have met then, and I won't say the rest of the funny part. But anyway, my cousin, who was a graduate of Walnut Hills High School and who's like a brother to me, and I decided we wanted to go to Michigan. So we both got in, and not a lot of my classmates applied at that time. But I took college boards anyway, just for fun, and that's when I got in the 2 Eastern Girls School. But there was never any choice. I was going to a Big Ten school.
So how did you find Michigan when you got here?
I loved it.
You did?
I had a really good time.
Did you join a sorority?
I was a sorority. I was an A-Phi.
So that was a Jewish sorority. So
right.
Was there anything more Jewishly that you did beyond?
Probably not more Jewishly, except when I would go home. I know once I gave a sermon at the temple. It was called "Hello College, Goodbye God." Oh. It was an honor to do that, though. That was nice.
Yes.
Yeah, and but A-Phi, we had tradition. We had Friday night, but no, it was we had a good time. It was more frivolous than religion.
How did you end up in the Detroit area? All
right, my junior year. Let's see, my junior year, I met Stuart Mittenthal, and who was an interesting man, and he had just graduated. He was out of school, and he was stationed outside of Cincinnati. So a mutual friend introduced us. And I won't go into the whole romance kind of thing, but I married him when I graduated. I went to Michigan for 3.5 years. I graduated early to get married, which, now I regret that because I really ruined my senior year. And I was the Rush chairman of the sorority, and I had to commute from Cincinnati for Rush because I was already out of school. And that's how I ended up in Detroit. And also my roommate was Jenny Jones's daughter, was my roommate, was my best friend at Michigan. Nancy Smith Hirsch was also my very good friend, and we all roomed together. And that's the Joneses actually became like my family here, and that will lead to the next question of how did I get involved.
Okay, so tell us about how you got involved in Federation.
Okay, so Jenny Jones, who was really a surrogate mother to me at that time, dragged me I was a bride, dragged me to leadership training. And the next thing I knew, I was in charge of the apartments, Huntington Gardens apartments, which we referred to as Rensselaer in Oak Park, which is where we lived. And we were going door to door, soliciting, and I was the captain. And from then on, that was it. And I will say that I was very homesick at first. I didn't even realize, I didn't even think how much I would miss Cincinnati and the family and my mother's activities and my dad as the physician, as my doctor. And Federation became a family to me.
So can I ask you what year this was?
This was 1958, 59.
58 and 59.
Right.
So do you remember some of the roles that you played?
Well, so captain of the door-to-door, whatever it was called then. I was involved in leadership training. I know I chaired Super Sunday relatively early. I became more campaign-oriented than anything else, more than the education.
Right.
And
Who
so,
are some of the people, some of the lay leaders that you remember working with in those days?
well, besides Jenny,
Right.
was Esther Jones and Tilly and Frida.
Say their whole names.
Okay, Tilly Brandwine, Frida Stolman, Barbara Marcuse, Carbo. Oh gosh, what was her first name? Come on. I know her first name, it'll come to me.
Okay.
Who else? Well, even Jane Sherman. Ruth Broder certainly has been my mentor for many, many years and is still my very good friend. Shirley Harris. I can remember the first campaign meeting I went to at Shirley's house, and I had my check written, and I thought I was being so wonderful. And they said to me, if you wrote the check, you can give more. I was so embarrassed, and I learned never to do that again, never to come with the money.
But that's a very interesting thing. That they would, in those days, a lot of days, they'd have little sayings like that.
Yes,
like,
yes, yes.
Give until it feels good.
Right, if you wrote the check today,
Right.
you're going to be able to give more.
So did you
Oh
give
yeah,
more?
absolutely.
Okay.
It was the beginning.
Were you among the youngest of the women that were involved in those that you remember? Or was there?
I don't think I was. I mean, Jane is younger than I am. I was in a group that maybe I was right at the upper limit of the age. I was about 22, 23 at that time.
So, do you want to tell us a little more about what you did in those days? Did you go to Israel at all?
Not until, was it this year in Jerusalem was my first time? Was in the 70s. No, I didn't go to Israel. And
When you were growing up, was Israel something that they talked about in your home?
we lived with my grandparents the first 11 years of my life, and my grandparents were more Israel-oriented. Cincinnati was not, it took many, many years, I think, for Cincinnati to become like we are, and it was not as big a factor. I more remember when Roosevelt died and Grandma crying, and no, it really was not.
So when you came here, did you find it was more Zionistic?
Yes, and I was, getting an education through Federation. And so I finally went on a women's mission, and the rest was history. I mean, I was absolutely a different person after that.
What year was that? Do you remember?
It was maybe 73, and then I went back many times.
So was that picture of the women that we see all the time from?
The We Are One picture?
Yeah.
No, that was a couple years later.
Okay, so you went on a few missions.
Yeah, oh yeah, they were all missions,
So this was something you did separate from your husband?
Absolutely.
You did not?
No, he was not involved in the community.
Yeah.
And it was obviously a need I had, and it really gave me another family. I mean, I became very close with a lot of people in Israel, and I remember dragging suitcases with tablecloths and towels and silverware and all kinds of stuff that they would ask me to bring. And I stayed in Hadera at the bus driver's house with his wife and his two children. And I stayed in Netanya I became very, very close with a lot of people there. And obviously it was a need I had. It filled something in my life.
Right. And it also was a way to really be involved with the state of Israel.
Well, and then I became, what happened to me nationally was when I came back from Israel the first time, and I was
in the early 70s.
Yes, I was like a maniac, and I remember I spoke for the women's, the women's division then, and I had this standard speech, if you ever stood on the Mount of Olives and looked at Jerusalem, and to this day Jane still quotes that. So I won, when I won the Greenberg Award, I was sent to the GA.
Let's go back a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so you in the early 70s,
Yeah.
was this?
Yes.
And when did you win the Greenberg Award?
It was, I don't remember the exact date, but we have to
Okay.
go look in the hall. And,
Right.
but they sent me to Philadelphia, and it was the year I remember of Legionnaire's disease, and we had to stay at the hotel that was, it was very funny. Anyway, I was at a women's meeting, and the speaker didn't come, and they had me sub, and I did my speech, and then I became on the National Speakers Bureau.
So did you do a lot of speaking
All
around the country?
All around the country. I didn't have the big cities. I had Evansville, I had Toledo, I had Cincinnati. I'm trying
And
to
you would
remember where
go
else
by
I-
yourself to these?
Yeah, yeah, and it was very uplifting for me. And I had, you know, I had really my canned speech about how turned on I was, and if you go, you'll be turned on. And it worked. And people identified with me, which was nice. And so that was, and so then I went on the National Women's Board.
Oh,
And I was on for several years, but then, as you know, I was divorced and I went to work, and that did make a big change in my life.
okay, so what year was that?
That was 1982. I think
So up
19
until about
no,
80
1980, I think. It was
So up
1980.
until about 1980,
I was
you were
nationally-
very involved,
very nationally active,
You were
yes.
involved with
and here.
and here.
And here.
And do you remember some of the roles you played
Well,
before 1980?
I chaired Super Sunday. I chaired leadership training. I don't think anything in education. I don't think Spring Forum or what was the other one? Fall Yeah.
Fall Institute.
Fall Institute. Yeah, I didn't.
Did
chair
you
any
do
of them.
any? Were you chair of some of the divisions? Because in
Yes,
those days
yes,
we had a lot
yes.
of divisions.
Probably almost all of them working up.
Okay.
And as my gift increased, I was able to, you know, chair.
So then in 1980, your life changed.
My life changed. I
So
was
what
divorced.
direction did it go in at
Well,
that
I
point?
went to work, but I worked first for a state senator, for Doug Ross. I was his fundraiser. And interestingly enough, my background in Federation gave me the credential to be a development officer. Because I had a BA in English Lit, so I could cook and read books. I mean, that was it. And I worked for a short time for Doug, but it was a very small salary. I worked with Zena Kramer and Gilda Jacobs, and it was wonderful. And I have great respect for him. But I knew at that point I really needed to have a job that made some money. So first I worked in the house for Hebrew University.
And what did that entail?
I was raising funds for Hebrew University. But it was, the organization at that time locally was not so, anyway. And then I was interviewed, no, when did I go to work for Wayne State? I guess after that I got a job for Wayne State, and I ran the Anthony Wayne Society for several years. It had been Catherine Gribbs, the mayor's wife, it had been her baby. And it was fascinating to me because who gave to Wayne State were the doctors who graduated and the lawyers who graduated, but it was really like pulling teeth to get money for Wayne State. I think it's gotten a lot better since then. But during that time, I had an interview with the field director for the Weizmann Institute of Science, the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute of Science. And I was hired, and that was a terrific job. I worked for them for 10 years.
So what was your position for Weizmann?
I was the executive director of the Detroit chapter of the American Committee for the Weizmann Institute of Science.
So what were your responsibilities as?
Well, what we did really was have a major dinner and honorees, and we raised a lot of money on the honorees. And they were, you know, Federation people. They were Bormans and Erwin Green and Florine and the Berries.
So your
and
background and all your contacts with Federation was probably very
absolutely.
helpful when you were
And, you know, and I
doing
never liked
Weizmann.
asking for money, ever. It was always painful, but I did. And I did it in a way where I sort of became the friends of who I was speaking to, and I commiserated with them somewhat. And I probably was a pushover. I was probably too easy. But Weizmann had this spectacular dinner every year with, you know, great entertainment and, you know, the format that a lot of organizations did. And it was 10 years. And actually, when I remarried, I stayed on with Weitzman for several years, and I said the ideal is working because you want to, because you don't have to. And
So-
that was really neat.
So you worked for Weitzman for 9 years.
10 years,
10
10 years. But the last few years I was married, and I really enjoyed my job, and actually I worked part-time, which was interesting because I did as much work part-time as I did full-time, but it was still a wonderful job. And at the same time, I was still involved in the women's division.
As a
I was the chair of the, what do we call it? The Working Women.
Working Women's Network.
Yeah.
Okay.
I chaired that as a working woman.
Do you remember some of the, in those days when you were working at Weitzman and you were still involved in Federation, who were some of the presidents and people that you worked with at that time?
Oh, gee.
Diane?
No. Gosh.
Linda
it's-
Klein?
Maybe Linda. No, Linda and I were around the same time.
But you
President.
were the campaign chair for who?
Is that awful? Wait a minute.
Was it
Might have been Linda.
Linda or Beverly?
No, Beverly was my
Oh, okay.
associate.
Your associate, yeah, okay.
We'll have to look on the wall. I think
Okay.
I think it was Linda.
So anyways, you're working and you're still doing Federation
Right,
activities.
right.
So
This truly was my family in Detroit. I mean, Stuart's family had left Detroit, and Donald's family really wasn't here either. And so this was home for me. It really was.
So
And-
you were close with the Shermans and
Right. Jane was always very, very good to me and stood by me always. And I know her really well.
Okay, so you did. Let's hear about Hydrocar because you were the first. Talk
Right.
about that.
That was really exciting, and that was just when I had started to date Donald at the same time. And Susie and I had the best time, and we had a wonderful
Talk
group.
about what it was.
We took young women who had never been to Israel, who had potential to be leadership in the community, and they were somewhat hand-picked, I guess. And the meetings ahead of time were always very uplifting and wonderful. And to this day, most of those women remained very active and became the leaders. And
So you accomplished what you
and
wanted to.
at the time, socially, Donald was in my life. My life was getting really back on track, and I was still working, and my kids were fine, and it was a very uplifting time. But Hadracha was really a very special mission, really was.
So how soon after that did you take on the major leadership roles in Federation in women's department?
Because I stayed working, I'm trying to think what I did during those few years that I stayed working. As soon as I retired, which was, oh boy, I'm trying to think of the date, the year. Well, regardless,
It was in the 80s,
I
maybe
was asked to
85
be
or
the
86.
associate campaign chair. I guess for Linda. I have to look, really, we'll go in the hall and look on the wall. And then I became the campaign chair, which was the best job. I think I liked that more than the presidency. It was really a very fulfilling job. And I was campaign chair for 2 years. And then, as many of us went on to be president, I only took it for 1 year because my husband wanted to live in Florida in the winter. His mother was in Palm Beach, and I kept saying, I'm not ready to do that, but we did it. And I commuted at first. I remember we went to Florida and bought a house, and I was there 1 week, and I had to fly home because I was the president. And he looked at 14 houses in the neighborhood, and he said, we're going to buy a house in this neighborhood. And we've been there 22 years now.
So what inspired you to work your way up to the presidency?
Well, as I said, Federation was my home away from home. I think knowing how fulfilling my mother's life was because of her activities, not being a Detroiter, and you can probably identify with that too from the beginning. I didn't have, I didn't know everybody I hadn't gone to grade school with all these girls who are still friends to this day. And it was a way to know the community. And, but the cause was paramount. Not just the local cause, but because I was very Israeli, in love with Israel.
So, can you describe some of your duties as campaign chair and then also your duties as president?
Geez, Susie, was so long ago. Let's think what we used to do. Well, meetings. We went to many meetings. It was,
sure did.
And you know, we probably all know this, that the kids, I don't say they suffered because of it, but they knew where Mom was a lot. And I think in a way it was maybe hard for my children, although they never really seemed embittered by it at all. But
well, in those days we had a lot of divisions.
right.
And each division would have a meeting.
I went to all the meetings,
And
everything.
we had to have chairs for all the divisions and
Right,
associate
right,
chairs.
right.
So you were interacting with a lot of the
Absolutely,
women.
absolutely.
And then you said that you liked being campaign chair almost better than president.
It was just
How
very
would you
rewarding,
describe being
very
president?
Well, I enjoyed the meetings. I tried to make them fun and interesting and not too long. I didn't love going to every committee meeting, but we did. I mean, we had to. You know, and I was still somewhat, not a new bride, but I was still had that pool. So it was a little more difficult than it might have been had we been an old married couple. But I'm kind of a ham, and I loved, if you forgive that expression, I liked being in front of everybody. I enjoyed running the meetings. I really did enjoy that, and I tried to make them interesting.
Did you go on missions? Do you remember going on any missions as campaign chair or president?
I went really more when I was involved nationally. I went to the Line of Judah meetings in Israel. I took Donald with me.
Mm-hmm.
We went also on a mission to, this was actually before we were married. We went to Russia with Jane and Larry, and that was, and then on to Israel. That was Donald's first trip to Israel. And it was fascinating at the caucus watching what happened to him. As you see people, you know, get turned on. And I was blown away because he had lived in Chicago for many years, and they had really not, JUF is very good there, but for some reason he was always overlooked. And this time he wasn't, and but he was really turned on.
Well, that was good.
Yeah.
So he could support
He went to
you.
Israel twice with me, yeah.
Do you remember some of the challenges you might have faced as campaign chair or as president?
Well, as campaign chair, we were trying to have I think, was that our first $1 million campaign? I think it was. We were really trying to get to that mark. I think just overseeing, making sure everybody did their job. And
So can you look back and point to any of the achievements during your time that you're particularly proud of?
well, I was very proud to get the Greenberg Award. That was
Well, no,
that
I'm
was young.
Specifically
Oh,
talking
as
about
as campaign chair.
Like, you know how when you become campaign chair or president, you have certain goals. Did you feel?
Well,
that there
we
was
did make the monetary goal.
That's great.
And everybody reacted nicely to me because I guess I'm a little bit soft with a lot of the women. I understand, and I commiserated with them, and everybody seemed to respond very nicely to me. I was proud of that. I really wish I could have done it 2 years. I really think that it was very fulfilling for me, but I had this pull from the Slotkin guy, and so
Wow.
I let it go, and I messed up the secession in that year. You know, it was like it straightened out.
You know what? It's good that you were able at least to have served in those positions.
Yeah, oh,
you know,
I'm
at the
thrilled
same
that I
time you were
have that.
trying
I
to-
almost wore the gavel today too, but I didn't know where to put it.
Okay.
But Jane only was president for 1 year.
Right.
There were some of us who only took it for a year.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to ask you a couple more generic questions. What skills do you think make a good leader?
Oh, I think compassion, warm and friendly to whomever you are dealing with. I really had good luck. I really did. At the meeting just last week, a woman who I solicited for years, who I really didn't know, and she lived in the winter on the west coast of Florida. She came up to me at the meeting, and we were like best friends, and we had never met face to face before. And that was very...
That was the first time you met her?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
wow, that's quite something.
In person, yes.
Wow.
But we were buddies on the phone, and I think, I have a good phone way with myself, I think. I was proud of that. I was proud that I made friends and no enemies soliciting. It was a good feeling.
So do you remember the staff that you worked with when you were in campaign chair or as president?
Okay, so I think in the early years as associate campaign, I think Barbara Satinsky was still staff, but I think Michelle Passon followed her. Mm-hmm. And that's who I worked very closely with, and Sandy Jaffa. I think those two were my people. Okay. And we're still buddies to this day, which is very nice too.
So do you think you were affected with the transition in staff? It sounds like you went through, a few different.
Well, I think Sally was in there too at that time. Sally Krugel.
She was before, I think.
She was before.
I
yeah.
think so. Yeah. Were you affected by that transition?
Well, it's always disconcerting, but they've always pretty much managed to find spectacular women to take the place of the previous one. And to this day, it's a tradition. The staff has always been wonderful, really has.
So, do you feel that women solicit differently than men, and how so?
I hope so. I think so. Yeah, I think the men maybe don't get as personal as we do. And I think we certainly understand the restrictions of having children and making a home, and being a volunteer is not always easy if you have other obligations. Although the men, they work too, obviously. But I think the women are not as staff-driven as the men are. So, we're more hands-on.
How did Women's Philanthropy, Women's Department interact with the general campaign? And did you feel that Federation valued women's?
Not for a long time. And we saw the progression. And I think we finally have come into our own. Well, as the women took more leadership roles too, as we had women presidents, that was a big breakthrough, a huge breakthrough, and they've been terrific. I think all of them have been terrific. Who was the first one? Was Penny the first one?
Yes.
Yeah. From then on, it's been...
Well, we've only had 3, so Penny, Nancy, and now Beverly. So what are your hopes for the women's philanthropy in the future?
Well, I haven't been, because we live in Florida for so long, I haven't been to too many meetings, but the annual meeting, I was so thrilled because we have terrific young women. It is in such good hands.
Good.
That I don't worry about women's philanthropy. The hardest thing for us is calling it women's philanthropy because we still call it women's division. Ruthie Broder and I, women's division.
I think we can end this right there. Thank you so much. I think that's true. We love our women's department.
In my calendar I write WD instead of WP. I can't help it. That WD to me is still it.
Edie, thank you.
Thank you, Susie.
This was fun.
Okay.